The shape resolved itself out of the dusk slowly, a thing made of dust and twilight and exhaustion. It was not a deer, for it walked on two legs, and it was not a man, for it was too slight, too hesitant in its staggering progress across the hardpan that baked in the day and bled its heat back to the cooling sky at night. Silas watched it from the porch, his hand still on the pump handle where he'd been filling the trough. The rhythmic squeak of the iron silenced. He had stood there for a long time, watching the sun burn itself out along the western rim of the world, a nightly ritual that settled the day's work in his bones. But this was a disruption. This was something new. He remained still, a habit born of a life spent watching animals and weather, letting the thing reveal itself on its own terms. It stumbled, caught itself, and kept moving toward the single point of light that was his lamp, a moth drawn to a flame it did not understand. He could see the torn dress now, the bare feet, the way one arm was wrapped tight around her middle, as if holding herself together. She did not seem to see him, her eyes fixed on the yellow square of the window. She was a vessel of pure forward motion, and he had the sense that if she stopped, she would simply fall and not get up again. She reached the edge of his swept yard, her feet finally leaving the cracked earth for the slightly softer dirt, and the change in texture seemed to break the spell. She stopped, swayed, and her head lifted. Her eyes found him then, a shadow within the deeper shadows of the porch, and a sound escaped her, a dry little gasp, the sound of a cornered animal that has no fight left in it. She took one step back, then her legs gave out, folding under her with a quiet finality, and she collapsed into a heap of torn calico and pale limbs on the ground. Silas did not move for another full minute. The wind picked up, whispering through the dry grass at the edge of the yard, carrying the scent of sage and distant rain. The world was vast and indifferent, and this small, broken thing had washed up at his door. He let out a slow breath he hadn't realized he was holding, the air rasping in his throat. He set the bucket down, the water sloshing over the rim. He walked down the 3 porch steps, his boots making no sound in the soft dirt. He knelt beside her, not touching, just looking. Her face was smudged with dirt and tears, her hair a tangled mess, and there was a tremor running through her whole body that was deep and abiding, a quake in her very foundations. He could see the pulse beating frantically in the hollow of her throat. He saw fear. He had seen it before, in horses and in men. It was all the same. He went back to the house and returned with a dipper of water and a blanket. He knelt again and held the dipper to her lips, which were cracked and pale. She flinched but did not pull away, and after a moment, she drank, her throat working convulsively. She drank until it was gone, then looked at the empty dipper as if it were a miracle. He draped the heavy wool blanket over her shoulders. "You're safe here," he said, and the words felt strange in his mouth, loud in the immense quiet. They were the first words he had spoken to another soul in weeks. She said nothing. She only trembled. That night, he bedded her down in the empty stall in the barn, the one meant for a birthing mare, filled with clean, sweet-smelling hay. He left the barn door open a crack to the night air and set a lantern on a hook just outside, casting a low, gentle light that pushed back the deepest of the shadows. He brought her a bowl of stew, thick with potatoes, and the last of the salted beef, and a hunk of bread. He set it down on a crate just inside the stall, then retreated to the far side of the barn to mend a piece of tack, the rhythmic pull and push of the awl and waxed thread of familiar comfort. He did not watch her, but he was aware of her every movement, the rustle of the hay, the small scrape of the spoon against the bowl. The silence stretched, filled only by the sounds of his work and the soft sighing of his horse in the next stall. When he finally looked, the bowl was empty, scraped clean. She was huddled in the corner, wrapped in the blanket, her eyes watching him. They were wide and dark in the lantern light, and they held no trust, only a weary, waiting vigilance. He finished his work, hung the bridle on its peg, and stood. "There's a lock on the inside of that stall door," he said to the space between them. "No one will bother you." He turned and walked out, pulling the great barn door closed behind him, the heavy wood groaning into place. He did not hear the bolt slide home. He stood for a long time in the yard, looking at the barn, a solid shape against the star-dusted sky. He had lived alone for 10 years, his world defined by the fences he maintained and the seasons he endured. His life was a set of simple, repeating patterns, a fortress of solitude built not of stone, but of routine. And now, a stranger was sleeping in his barn. A tremor of unease, of something other than loneliness, moved through him. He checked the sky, a habit ingrained so deep it was instinct. No rain tonight. The air was cool and clean. He went inside, bolted his own door, and sat in the dark. The silence of the house was different now. It was no longer empty. It was waiting. Days later, she did not speak. He did not press her. Her name, her past, where she had come from. These were questions that hung unanswered in the air, and he let them hang. He called her ma'am on the rare occasions he needed to address her directly. He would leave food for her on the porch in the morning and in the evening, and she would take it when she thought he wasn't looking. She moved from the barn to the small spare room off the kitchen, a space that had held nothing but dust and forgotten things for a decade. She kept to herself, a ghost in the corners of his life. He would catch glimpses of her through the window as he worked, a fleeting shape sweeping the porch or tending the small neglected vegetable patch behind the house with a fierce, silent concentration. She mended one of his shirts she'd found in a pile, the stitches so fine and even they were nearly invisible, a line of perfect, tiny knots that spoke of a patience he could not fathom. He wore the shirt, and the feel of the mended cloth against his skin was a strange and unfamiliar sensation. Her presence was a quiet weight. It changed the rhythm of his days. He found himself looking toward the house more often, his eyes scanning for a flicker of movement at the window. He started talking to his horse more, just to hear a voice that wasn't his own thoughts. The silence between them was not empty. It was a living thing, filled with her fear and his caution. One afternoon, he was trying to reset a shoe on the mare, a skittish beast that had never fully trusted him. She kept pulling her hoof away, her eyes rolling back, her body tense as a coiled spring. He spoke to her in a low, steady voice, but the tension only grew. He was about to give up, to let her be for the day, when the woman appeared at the barn door. She stood there for a moment, watching, her hands twisting in the fabric of her worn dress, a dress he had bought for her along with boots and other necessities on his last trip to town, leaving them on the porch without a word. She took a hesitant step forward, then another. She did not look at him, only at the horse. She began to hum a low, tuneless sound, a vibration more than a melody. It was a sound from the bottom of a well, old and sad and strangely calming. The mare's ears twitched, swiveling toward the sound, her head lowered slightly. The woman kept humming as she approached, her movements slow and deliberate, her body language speaking of nothing but peace. She reached out a hand, not to the horse's head, but to her shoulder, letting it rest there with impossible lightness. The mare shuddered once, a release of tension that ran through her like a current, and then stood still, her breathing evening out. The woman kept humming, her hand stroking the horse's neck. Silas watched, his own hands frozen in midair. He had worked with horses his entire life. He knew their language of fear and trust. What he was seeing was something else, a deeper communion. After a long moment, the woman nodded toward the hoof, a small, quick gesture. It was the first communication she had offered. He bent down slowly, picked up the mare's hoof, and this time she let him. He worked quickly, rasping the hoof, setting the shoe, hammering the nails with clean, efficient blows. The entire time, the woman stood by the mare's head, humming her quiet, broken tune, her hand never leaving the horse's neck. When he was done, he straightened up. "Thank you," he said. She gave another small nod, her eyes still on the horse. She patted the mare one last time, then turned and walked back to the house, disappearing inside as silently as she had appeared. Silas stood there, the hammer heavy in his hand, the scent of her strange, sad song seeming to hang in the dusty air of the barn. He looked at the mare, who was now calmly munching hay from her manger. He had lived on this land his whole life, and he thought he knew all its secrets. He was wrong. Weeks later, the town of Redemption was less a town than a necessary inconvenience. A single dusty street with a general store, a saloon, and a sheriff's office that was usually empty. Silas avoided it whenever he could, preferring the company of his own land, but supplies ran low, and there were things the earth would not provide. He needed salt and flour, coffee, and cartridges. He asked her if she needed anything. He stood on the porch, his hat in his hands, feeling awkward and intrusive. She was on her knees in the garden, her hands covered in dirt, coaxing green shoots from the stubborn soil. She looked up, her face shielded by a bonnet he hadn't seen before, and for the first time, she did not immediately look away. She seemed to consider it. "I will come," she said, her voice raspy from disuse, the words small and carefully chosen. It was the first full sentence he had heard her speak. He just nodded, turned, and went to hitch the wagon. The ride to town was silent, the only sounds the creak of the wagon wheels and the plodding of the horses. She sat on the bench beside him, straight-backed and still, her hands folded in her lap. She looked at the passing landscape, the familiar mesas and arroyos, with the intensity of someone memorizing an escape route. When they reached the town, he saw the change in her. The stillness became a rigid tension. Her shoulders hunched, and her gaze dropped to the weathered floorboards of the wagon. People on the boardwalk stopped to watch them, their faces a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. A new woman with Silas Blackwood, the man who spoke to no one. It was an event. He helped her down from the wagon, his hand briefly touching her elbow, and she flinched, a small, almost imperceptible movement. But he felt it. Inside the general store, the air was thick with the smells of leather and dried goods, and the low murmur of gossip. The storekeeper, a man named Miller, gave Silas a curt nod and let his eyes linger on the woman for a moment too long. She kept her head down, her focus entirely on the list Silas had given her, her fingers tracing the words as if they were a talisman. That was when the men came in. There were 3 of them, led by a man whose clothes were too fine for the dust of redemption. His boots were polished, his hat was clean, and his smile was a lazy, confident thing that didn't reach his eyes. His name was Fletcher Jennings, and his family owned the biggest spread in the county, a fact he wore like a second skin. He saw her. The lazy smile tightened at the corners. He didn't approach, just leaned against the counter, watching them, making his presence a palpable force in the small room. The woman froze. Every line of her body went taut. The small bit of color that the sun had brought to her cheeks drained away, leaving her skin the color of parchment. She looked, in that moment, exactly as she had the night she arrived. A cornered thing with nowhere left to run. Silas saw it. He saw the way Jennings looked at her, a look of ownership, of casual possession, as if she were a stray calf he'd found on his land. And he saw the way the other people in the store suddenly found fascinating things to look at on the shelves or out the window. Their silence was a verdict. It was an acceptance of power. Silas moved to stand slightly in front of her, a small shift of his body that blocked Jennings's line of sight. He finished his transaction with Miller, his movements unhurried, his voice calm as he paid for his goods. He did not acknowledge Jennings at all. He gathered their sacks, handed one to her. "Time to go," he said, his voice low. As they walked toward the door, Jennings pushed himself off the counter. "Blackwood," he said, his voice smooth as oiled leather. "Didn't know you were in the business of taking in strays." Silas didn't stop. He didn't turn. He just kept walking, pushing the door open, ushering her out into the harsh sunlight. He heard a low chuckle from behind them. On the ride back, the silence was different. It was no longer a space of unanswered questions. It was heavy, with a known threat. When they were halfway home, she finally spoke, her voice barely a whisper. "His name is Jennings." Silas just nodded, his eyes on the horizon. "I know," he said. That night, a storm rolled in from the north, a great bruised curtain of a thing that swallowed the stars and filled the air with the electric smell of ozone. The wind howled around the small house, rattling the windows in their frames, a lonely and violent sound. Inside, a lamp cast a circle of warm light on the table where they sat. They had eaten their meal in silence, the sound of the rising storm a constant companion. The encounter in town had broken something, some unspoken truce of ignorance. The threat was no longer a shapeless phantom from her past. It had a name and a face and a pair of polished boots. Silas got up and added another log to the fire, the wood catching with a shower of sparks. He stood with his back to the flames, watching her. She was tracing patterns on the worn wood of the table with her finger, her face pale in the lamplight. "You don't have to tell me," he said, his voice quiet, almost lost in the shriek of the wind. "But if you do, it might help." She stopped her tracing and looked at her hands, as if she were surprised to find them there. She took a deep breath, a ragged, shuddering thing. "My name is Alara," she said. The name felt new in the room, a fragile piece of truth. "I was in his father's employ. I kept the books." She paused, and he waited. The story came out in small, halting pieces, like someone pulling shards of glass from a wound. She was an orphan, sold into indenture as a girl, to pay her family's debts. The Jennings family had owned her contract. She was educated, good with numbers, and Old Man Jennings had found her useful. For years, she had lived in their house, a ghost in the ledger books, invisible. But she was not unseeing. "He was cheating them," she whispered, her eyes fixed on the table. "The small ranchers, the ones who sold him their cattle. He was altering the weights in the books, paying them less than they were owed. A little from each one. Over years, it was a fortune." Silas listened, his face impassive, but a muscle tightened in his jaw. He knew those small ranchers. He was one of them. "I copied the pages," she went on, her voice gaining a sliver of strength. I thought if I had proof, I could go to the marshal in the next county." someone would listen. Fletcher, the son, had found her. He had found the pages she had hidden. He hadn't been angry. He had smiled that lazy smile. He'd told her she was much smarter than his father had given her credit for, and that such cleverness needed to be put to better use. He'd made it clear what that use would be. He saw her not as a threat, but as a new possession, more interesting than the others. "He locked me in my room," she said, her voice dropping again, the tremor returning. "He said we would be married in the spring. A contract, he called it, to ensure my silence, my loyalty." She had escaped 2 nights later, climbing out a window during a storm just like this one, taking nothing but the clothes she wore. She had run until she could not run anymore, living on fear and desperation, until she saw the light of his lamp. She fell silent. The only sound was the fire and the storm raging outside. The house, which had always felt like a fortress to Silas, suddenly felt very small and fragile. "He thinks I belong to him," she finished, her voice flat, devoid of all emotion. "He will come for me." Silas watched her for a long time. He saw the fine tremor in her hands, the exhaustion that was etched so deep around her eyes it was part of her. But he saw something else too. He saw the steel that had made her copy those pages, the courage that had made her climb out that window, the endurance that had brought her across miles of unforgiving country to his door. She was not a stray. She was a survivor. The wind tore at the roof, and a spatter of rain hit the window like a handful of thrown gravel. He walked over to the rifle that rested on pegs by the door. He took it down, checked the action, his movements economical and sure. He didn't look at her. "Let him come," he said. Afternoon. The heat was a physical presence, a heavy blanket that shimmered above the baked earth. For 3 days after the storm, the world was still and watchful. Silas worked, his hands busy with the familiar tasks of the ranch, but his mind was elsewhere. His eyes constantly scanned the long, empty track that led to his property. His rifle was never far from his hand. He had leaned it against the fence post while he mended a section of wire, its blued steel hot to the touch. Alara worked in the garden, her bonnet shielding her from the worst of the sun. There was a change in her. The rigid fear was still there, but it was overlaid with a quiet resolve. They worked in a shared, unspoken pact. 2 solitary people bracing for a single threat. The dusk came first, a small, rising plume on the horizon, miles away. It was too deliberate for a dust devil, too steady for a stray herd. Silas stopped his work, his hand resting on the stock of the rifle. He watched the dust cloud grow, resolving itself into the shapes of 3 riders. He picked up the rifle and walked back toward the house. Alara was already on the porch, her hands gripping the railing, her face a pale mask. She had seen them too. "Go inside," he said, his voice flat. "Lock the door." She looked at him, her eyes wide. For a second, he thought she would argue, but then she gave a sharp nod and disappeared into the house. The bolt slid home with a heavy, final sound. Silas did not go onto the porch. He stood in the yard, in the open, the rifle held loosely at his side, its barrel pointed at the ground. He was not a man who hid. He waited. The riders slowed as they approached, their horses kicking up small puffs of dust. It was Jennings, flanked by 2 hard-faced men who looked as if they were part of the saddles they sat on. They stopped just outside his fence line, a deliberate act of trespassing in spirit, if not in fact. Jennings sat his horse, looking at the small house, the tidy yard, the man standing alone in the sun. His gaze swept over everything with a dismissive air. He nudged his horse forward, stopping at the gate. "Blackwood," he called out, his voice carrying easily in the still air. "We've come for what's mine." Silas didn't answer. He just stood there, waiting, his stillness a form of reply. He was a part of the landscape, as rooted and unmoving as the old cottonwood by the well. Jennings's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. He was used to fear, to deference. This quiet immovability was something he didn't understand. "There's a warrant for her," Jennings said, patting a pocket in his coat. "Theft, signed by the sheriff himself. You're harboring a fugitive. That's a serious crime." The lie was smooth, practiced. Silas knew the sheriff in redemption. He was a man who signed whatever Jennings put in front of him. "She stole nothing," Silas said. His voice was not loud, but it carried, each word clear and precise. "She's not going with you." Jennings laughed, a short, ugly sound. "Is that so? You in what army, old man?" He looked at the 2 men with him, who smirked on cue. They were relaxed, confident. This was a simple errand. "This doesn't have to be difficult," Jennings said, his voice taking on a tone of false reason. "Just send her out. We'll be on our way. You can go back to your dirt and your silence." Silas raised the rifle until its stock rested against his hip. He still did not aim it. It was a statement, not yet a threat. "This is my land," he said, his voice as hard and flat as the ground they stood on. "You are not welcome on it. Turn around." For a long moment, nobody moved. The sun beat down. A fly buzzed near Silas's ear. The tension was a physical thing. A wire stretched to its breaking point. Jennings's eyes narrowed. The game was over. He looked at Silas, truly looked at him for the first time, not as a piece of the scenery, but as an obstacle. He saw the weathered face, the steady hands, the absolute lack of fear in his eyes. He saw a man who had made his decision, a man who had weighed the consequences and found them acceptable. Jennings was a bully, and the currency of a bully is fear. When fear is absent, he is bankrupt. He held Silas's gaze for another 10 seconds. A silent battle of wills fought across 20 yards of dusty earth. Then, with a flicker of annoyance, he looked away. He had miscalculated. This was not worth it. The woman was not worth it. He pulled on his reins, turning his horse in a tight, angry circle. "You'll regret this, Blackwood," he spat. "This isn't over." But it was. They all knew it. He spurred his horse and rode away without a backward glance, his men falling in behind him. Silas watched until they were just a receding cloud of dust on the horizon. He stood there for a long time after they were gone, the rifle growing heavy in his hands. The air seemed to cool, the silence returning, but it was a different silence now. It was the silence of a battle won. He lowered the rifle. He had not fired a shot. He had not needed to. He turned and saw Alara standing in the doorway. She had unlocked it at some point. She was holding his old shotgun, its twin barrels looking enormous in her small hands. Her face was still pale, but her eyes were dry and fierce. She had been ready to stand with him. He looked at her, and she looked back at him, and in that shared gaze, something shifted. The last of the fear between them finally broke and washed away, leaving something else in its place. Something quiet and strong. Something like home. Months later, autumn came to the high country, painting the cottonwoods along the creek bed in strokes of brilliant yellow. The air grew crisp and clear, and the nights were cold enough to demand a fire. The rhythm of the ranch changed with the season. Silas spent his days winterizing the barn and mending the last of the fences before the snow came, his movements unhurried, imbued with a deep and satisfying purpose. Alara spent hers in the garden, harvesting the last of the squash and beans, and in the kitchen, canning and preserving, filling the shelves of the small pantry with jars that caught the autumn light like jewels. The house was filled with the smells of baking bread and simmering preserves, smells that had been absent for a decade. Her presence was no longer a weight. It was an anchor. She spoke more now, her words still carefully chosen, but they came with more ease. She would tell him small things about the plants in her garden, or ask him about the names of the distant mountains. He, in turn, found himself explaining the ways of the land, the habits of the deer that came to the creek at dawn, the signs that foretold a hard winter. They were small conversations that, piece by piece, built a bridge across the silence that had once defined them both. They worked side by side, often without speaking for hours, but it was a comfortable silence now, born of understanding, not fear. He would be splitting wood, the rhythmic chunk of the axe a steady beat, and he would look up to see her on the porch, mending a shirt, her needle flashing in the sun. She had brought a quiet order to his life, a sense of purpose that went beyond simple survival. One evening, as the sun was setting, casting long purple shadows across the valley, they sat on the porch. He was cleaning his rifle, a task he performed with ritualistic care, and she was shelling beans into a large wooden bowl, the small, dry sound a peaceful counterpoint to his work. Neither had spoken for some time. "I never thanked you," she said suddenly, her voice soft in the twilight. He stopped his work, his hands still on the rifle. He looked at her. Her face was calm, the haunted look in her eyes all but gone, replaced by a quiet strength he had come to admire more than he could say. "You did not have to," he said. "Yes," she insisted, her gaze steady. "I do. You gave me a safe place." "You made it safe," he replied, and he knew it was the truest thing he had ever said. It was her courage that had defeated Jennings, not his rifle. Her refusal to remain a victim had been the rock upon which Jennings's threats had broken. He had only been the witness. She gave a small, sad smile. "We made it safe." She went back to her beans, and he went back to his rifle. The light faded completely, and the first stars appeared in the deep indigo sky. A comfortable quiet settled between them once more, a quiet that was full of things unsaid but understood. He had spent a lifetime believing that strength was a solitary thing, a wall you built around yourself. He was learning that sometimes true strength was a door you opened. He finished his work, stood the rifle by the door, and sat back down. The night was cold, but he did not feel it. He looked out at the vast, dark expanse of his land, at the star-dusted sky, and for the first time in as long as he could remember, he did not feel alone in it. The house behind him was warm. There was a light in the window. It was enough. It was everything. There is a moment in every life when you are called upon to be a shelter for someone else. A moment when the world asks you to stand in the way of a storm, not for your own sake, but for a stranger who has washed up at your door, tired and broken and out of hope. It rarely looks like a dramatic standoff at high noon. More often, it looks like a bowl of stew offered without question. It looks like a quiet refusal to step aside. It is the simple, powerful act of seeing someone's humanity when everyone else has looked away. Silas was not a hero in any traditional sense. He was a quiet man who wanted to be left alone. But his true strength was not in his solitude or his skill with a rifle. It was in his decision to not turn away, to offer sanctuary without demanding a reason, to stand his ground not with violence, but with the unshakable conviction that one small piece of the world, his small piece, would be a place of safety. He didn't save Alara, he gave her the ground on which she could save herself. And in doing so, he saved a part of himself he didn't even know was lost. We all have a fence line. We all have a gate. The most important question we will ever have to answer is what we do when someone comes knocking, trembling, and afraid. Do we bolt the door, or do we light a lamp and say, "You're safe here"? Thank you for spending this time with us. If this story meant something to you, we would be grateful if you'd let us know by liking it and subscribing to our channel for more tales of quiet courage and earned redemption. And we invite you to share in the comments below. Who was the person who offered you shelter when you needed it most? Until next time, be the light in someone else's darkness.